Hello, Stay. Jacques Derrida wrote about language that every sign, linguistic or non-linguistic, spoken or written, as a small or large unity, can be cited, put between quotation marks. Thereby it can break with every given context and engender infinitely new contexts in an absolutely non-saturable fashion. This does not suppose that the mark is valid outside its context, but on the contrary, that there are only contexts without any center of absolute anchoring. This citationality, duplication, or duplicity, this iterability of the mark is not an accident or anomaly, but is that without which a mark could no longer even have a so-called normal functioning. What would a mark be that one could not cite, and whose origin could not be lost on the way? Derrida was a post-structuralist philosopher and is most well known for his concept of deconstruction, the idea that all language is based on an understanding of other language, that in order to understand one word, we must understand concepts and structures upon which that word is based. A forest is not a collection of flora and fauna until we understand flora and fauna. There are no trees in a forest until we understand tree as a concept separate from forest itself. And in this way, Derrida argues, language is in fact what creates reality. Our realities are built based on our understanding of what we are surrounded by and how those systems work. A forest is not, in reality, a collective of trees unless our perception of reality includes knowledge of trees. A tree is not a collective of bark and branches and leaves until we have knowledge of what bark and branches and leaves are and how they form to create a tree. There is at least one arborist who is distressed at my minimal definition of trees, and for them, their reality is simply slightly different from mine. Ultimately, many of our problems of being human come down to definitions, to the structure of our language. I spend many hours a week as a clinician interrogating definitions with clients. What do you mean by that? What is it to be successful or unsuccessful? What does it mean to feel you are worthless? And to the contrary, what would it be to be worthy? What is it to be good or bad? When you try to define good and bad, things start to go wrong. Nietzsche wrote extensively about how little meaning there is in the concepts of good and bad, virtue and evil, morality and heathendom, normal and abnormal. What is it to be normal? Stay. Welcome to Stray Kids, the Megaverse, a podcast dedicated to 8 infinitely strange, yet infinitely typical human entertainers. My name is Lullaby B, and I am an autistic queer disabled therapist who specializes in neuroaffirming therapy for multiply marginalized individuals. Before we get started, proper stay. I have my tea. Do you have yours? Have you hydrated, you ADHD motherfucker? Yeah, that's right, I'm looking at you. And if I'm not looking at you, well, it's because I'm looking at a computer screen. And if I'm not looking at you, have you hydrated, whoever I am looking at? It doesn't have to be tea. But drink something. Or eat something. Whichever one is applicable. Now, I was expecting this to be part 1 of what I had thought would be either a 2 or 3-part series. I have 7,000 words written of the script, so we'll see if I get through that. And I didn't finish what I wanted to get through. So more likely, we're looking at more than 2 to 3 parts. So this is part 1 of a question mark part series on neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and expectations of conformity. I am incredibly excited for this. Obviously, this is one of my domains of expertise. I know that also this is something that a lot of people on threads have communicated being really interested in talking about. I know that Stray Kids attracts a lot of not just neurodivergent, but like especially within neurodevelopmental neurodivergences, autistic, ADHD, etc. A lot of folks of those neurotypes. And hopefully that will be fun for everyone. For most planned series, I'll usually do the parts in reverse. I'll usually start with a Stray Kids storyline or theme, and then do a State of the Meta review afterwards. There's a few reasons for that. One, the State of the Meta for a lot of my planned series tends to be more depressing, but also it's more fun to build from the ground up in my mind that way. But for this particular series, I just strongly realized that there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, just straight up bullshit about neurodivergence out there. And so I didn't want to go into the analysis of Stray Kids without building out the neurodivergence concept framework first, building that groundwork and making sure we're all working with the shared vocabulary that I'm so fond of. So we are starting with the State of the Meta, and then once I've gotten through all of that, or at least enough of that, we will move on to the storylines and themes from there. To that end, today's songs are S-Class, Cheese, and Voices. There were so many options for this episode's songs, so I chose what I thought are representative of the breadth of their songs about being both societally and internally viewed as atypical. This episode is going to have a lot of concepts. I have begun to become even more aware of how many English as a second language stay there are, which is incredible. It also makes me want to really make sure that I'm explaining as much as possible. My academia can tend towards I'm trying to find a word that explains the type of vocabulary I have without it being like an SAT word, which I think goes to show my problem. It tends to be a little too much, even for native speakers. So I'm going to tend towards defining things a lot. That being said, as always, I recommend that you do look things up if you don't know words. There's no shame in that, no matter your level of fluency. And for those of you who are on a similar academic wavelength, you'll just have to be a little patient if it feels like I'm over-explaining certain words. Okay. Let's start. I am going to first lay out my main point, lay out the thesis, before we begin at the basics. Build it up, and then tear it down. Construct, deconstruct. Idols exist in a sphere where they, as people, must be appropriately palatable. That is to say, appropriately tasteful, appropriately catered to large audiences, to lots of people. This is true for the creation of many artistic endeavors, and as with many artistic endeavors, there are a few ways to do this. There is the very common method of watering down the creative content until it is easy to experience, digest, and engage with, until it's as easy as possible to engage with it. This is a bit of the cookie cutter method. It's what often happens in large corporations trying to make art while wrangling with massive hierarchies. We can call this the Marvel method. Then there is the method of leaning hard into a niche of the art and emphasizing the artistic endeavor of it, whether that's a particular message, a particular technique, etc. This creates broad appeal through being novel while still speaking to the cultural zeitgeist, that is, the cultural moment, what is currently happening broadly in culture. We can call this the arcane method. Marvel movies, how they're made, how they have been made, how they will continue to be made, versus Arcane and its future spin-offs, how it was made and how it will continue to be made. These were both massive IPs, hugely popular, from completely different directions. That being said, there are, however, always expectations, no matter the direction you come at it with. There are limits, boundaries, requirements. Certain rules and structures must be maintained for not just broad appeal, but also broad access. For instance, the developers of Arcane had to reportedly cut a large portion of the sex scene between Kate and V. K-pop artists are known to rarely curse in their songs, especially earlier stage artists. They're known to not be overly sexual on stage or speak overly directly about sex in songs, and this is largely due to requirements of broadcasting networks that limit the allowance of profanity that's aired on them, as well as the requirements of receiving awards. And all of this is managed primarily by the Korea Communication Standards Commission. So those are, a couple examples of our understanding of limits and boundaries and requirements for the sake of access. Idols must be interesting enough to be differentiable, but not so mold-breaking as to properly and truly deconstruct the expectations of what an idol is and how they are meant to fit in. The thing is that idols are people, not a created art form inherently. They're individuals, even if they make up a group that is managed and molded by a company. Stray Kids, as reality entertainment, may be created and manipulated, whether by the company or by themselves, as spoken about in the State of the Meta introduction. But each stray kid is a human, and together they are simply a group of people. So when we're talking about palatability, about novelty, about expectations of the art, in the end, we're still talking about who they are as human people, and then which roles or personas they're inhabiting, whether by choice or by nurture or by the nature of how their brains work. This is where that dichotomy, the duality, the counterplay between two forces, this is where that dichotomy of fascination and expectation in behavior and personality meet. I call this place the overlap in the Venn diagram, right? We have fascination versus expectation for behavior. And that sliver of overlap I refer to as the NeuroPlatonic ideal. People who are novel, but not bizarre. Fascinating, but not controversial. Authentic, but without any visibly broken pieces. Different, but not too different. The ideal person with the ideal mind and the ideal behavior. One large reason for Stray Kids' popularity, arguably, is that they break much of the NeuroPlatonic ideal of idols. But in doing so, they have created a new NeuroPlatonic ideal for themselves, which they may well be just as trapped in. Their popularity now gives them a level of freedom to show the reality of how they function in the world, but it also means there are that many more expectations from that many more people of who they are and who they are supposed to be. So that's our construction. If you're not following yet, that's fine. I've said a lot of things, and that's okay. Because now it is time for deconstruction. We will deconstruct, and we will rebuild back up. But we will not finish doing that until the next episode. We do not finish rebuilding back up by the end of this episode, but it'll happen. I am going to go through a number of things that some of you will think of as basics, but many of you will think that you think of as basics, but you don't know them as well as you think you do. If you listen to my introduction on storylines, I said, for some of you who are sort of experts in this place, you can probably skip over this huge part. Unless you actually are an expert in neurodivergence, I don't recommend that. Like I said, there is a lot of bad information out there. Frankly, I've seen a lot of it come from clinicians as well. So I recommend digging your heels in, even if you feel like you know some of this stuff. So we're going to discuss the history of neurodivergence as a concept. And then we're going to pivot to talking about deficit versus anti-deficit models of disability. We're going to talk about stigma. We're going to talk about euphemisms. We're going to talk about barriers to access in understanding and diagnoses of both neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as other innate and acquired neurodivergences. And throughout it all, I'm going to talk about Stray Kids. This state of the meta, rather than saying a bunch of stuff and then getting to the K-pop of it all, the K-pop of it all will be integrated throughout. So I'll say a bunch of stuff, we'll come back to the K-pop of it all. I'll pivot to some other stuff, we'll come back to the K-pop. I'll pivot to some other stuff, we'll come back to the K-pop. Sort of woven throughout. I won't get super deep into some of it because a lot of it I will be talking about in the storylines and themes episodes, but it'll be sort of meshed throughout. Oh, I wrote in tea break here. Damn. Good job, me. I really wrote out this whole damn script, huh? You should drink some tea. If you're on Threads, then you know about the Chan cult. I don't know if I'm proud or ashamed to say that I was one of the first 10 to 15 instigators. Probably ashamed. We didn't think it'd go that far. But it was really fun to tell my friends when they asked me what I had done recently that I started a cult. They all knew it was K-pop related. I wonder how. Okay. We're bringing it back now. Oh god, now I just got bounce back in my head. Fuck. Whew. Okay. The history. The term neurodivergence is often attributed to Judy Singer. This is a massive misattribution. I'm not quite sure how it even happened, honestly. So Judy Singer, who does suck, by the way, we all recently found out, is a TERF, popularized the term neurodiversity, though the term had been used for a couple years prior to her popularizing it online. And it was actually first published in an Atlantic article by Harvey Bloom. I don't know how people started attributing neurodivergence to her. I assume the same way that people started determining that neurodiversity and neurodivergence are the same term. So we can basically ignore all of that, which is great because I don't like referencing TERFs if I don't have to. So neurodiversity, as a singular word, came about as I said, from Online Spaces, first published by Harvey Bloom, refers to only the biological fact that there is diversity in our brains as humans. That's it. That's all it means. This is a wildly misused word so often. There are not quote-unquote neurodiverse individuals, just the same way that there are not quote-unquote diverse individuals. Like, when a manager who's trying really hard not to be racially biased, but like definitely is, says that they're trying to retain their diverse employees, and you're like, bro, this is why you're the problem. It's the same thing here, right? There are not neurodiverse individuals, the same way there are not diverse individuals. Now, arguably, on the flip side, there are only neurodiverse or diverse individuals, one or the other. Either way, neurodiversity is just a term to acknowledge the fact that brains are all different. Neurodivergence, however, is a different term with a different meaning. Neurodivergence and neurodivergent as terms are attributed, and I have not heard this name, so I'm hoping for the best here, are attributed to Cassian Asamas in about the year 2000, and it refers to brains that deviate from the typical. This is where our concept of neurotypical comes from. For those of you who want to look her up, the spelling of her name is Kassiane. Cassian. Asamas. Asasumasu. Neurodivergent, importantly, is not a euphemism for autistic. It's also not a term that necessarily refers to any brain-altering experience. We'll get into some of the nuance there, but just to put out there, defining what is and isn't neurodivergence is a rather controversial conversation. I recognize that. I've come up with a definition that I think is pretty even-keeled, but we need to talk about a few other things before I actually fully put it out there. In the meantime, our first base definition is to have factors in our brain that deviate it from the typical or expected brain. So there are innate neurodivergences, things that are fundamental, that we are born with, and that will likely be permanent or indefinite in some way. Innate neurodivergence includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Down syndrome, certain types of genetic-based epilepsy, potentially some forms of OCD. We're still kind of uncertain on that front, etc. Acquired neurodivergence is the inverse. It is neurodivergence that happens to someone later on in life. They are not born with it. It may be permanent. It might be curable or changeable. This includes things like traumatic brain injuries, PTSD and complex PTSD, borderline or narcissistic personality disorders, schizophrenia, structured dissociation, etc. Eating disorders have massive impact on brain functionality to the point that people in the midst of active disordered eating often report feeling and acting like they are completely different people. We know that most mental health concerns have impact on the functioning of the brain to greater or lesser degrees. We know that some of these impacts can be reversed. Depression, PTSD, anxiety, etc., all have evidence that the way they change the brain can, with appropriate treatment, be sometimes completely reversed. I haven't had any brain scans. No, I need more tea before I talk about my lack of brain scans. I haven't had any brain scans, so I couldn't say this for certain. But I can say that while my autism is permanent, the complex PTSD I had for many years and still have some symptoms of, I don't believe is any longer really part of my multiply neurodivergent landscape. It certainly was for many years, but I don't know that it still is. It's not to say that I am completely cured of all of my PTSD symptoms. It's that those symptoms specifically, I don't believe impact me to a disabling degree. It's important that we understand the difference between acquired and innate neurodivergence when we are talking about disability activism. But first, as promised, we pivot back to K-pop. We know that there are neurodivergent idols. Every idol who has died by suicide, and for those who don't know, we do try to move away from the committed or completed suicide language. The preferred language we have at the moment would be died by suicide or killed themselves. But regardless, every idol who dies by suicide was neurodivergent, even if that neurodivergence is acquired depression or PTSD or whatever it may be. As mentioned, disordered eating can cause major changes to the brain, including the development of OCD, significant behavioral changes, inability to process and learn new information, increased emotional dysregulation, etc. And we know, as I spoke at length about in the State of the Meta introduction episode, that eating disorders are very common and actively encouraged in idol culture. And no, it doesn't matter that you see idols eat on lives. That actually means quite literally nothing about whether or not they have disordered eating. Eating is a communal activity. Eating on lives is like kind of part of their job. So, regardless, moving on. However, we often know about an idol's neurodivergence in retrospect, whether because of suicide or because an idol comes out many years later talking about their experiences. There are exceptions. There are very notable exceptions. DPR Ian, of course, is famous for speaking openly about his experiences with bipolar and structured dissociation, which are much more significant as far as the stigma attached to them of neurodivergences for idols to be talking about. But DPR Ian also runs his own agency, which is likely a huge part of the reason he's able to be so open about his neurodivergence. There are other idols who are openly neurodivergent. Jackson Got7, Henry from Super Junior M, and Park Baum of 2NE1 have all spoken about having ADHD, although unfortunately for Baum, that was largely due to a drug quote-unquote scandal, wherein she was prescribed amphetamines in the US and had them sent to herself in Korea. At the time, amphetamines were illegal in Southern Korea, including for purposes of ADHD management. That's no longer the case, however. It is very difficult to bring stimulants into the country, even with a prescription, and not all ADHD medications are available. This is just important context when we're thinking about like the social mode of disability. Sunmi has opened up about her experiences with borderline personality disorder. Actually said, I debuted at such an early point in my life. I got my start in society too young. We're supposed to develop the self in our teenage years, but I spent most of that time in a car. I think it's important to reflect on yourself, to learn what you like and what you're good at, to learn how to deal with your feelings. I've understood that now. The medicine I take has been reduced a lot, so there's no need to worry. I'm very strong. I've gotten stronger. She even wrote a song about her experiences. Many people, even clinicians, believe that cluster B personality disorders, BPD, NPD, ASPD, etc., are uncurable or even untreatable. This isn't accurate. BPD is a neurodivergence, usually a long-term one. However, it's not one that is necessarily permanent. However, getting to the point of no longer meeting diagnostic or disabling criteria takes many, sometimes tens of years of highly competent treatment. Due to stigma, poor education, poor access to care, this does mean that for many borderline folks, it is an indefinite, if not lifelong, neurodivergence. Notably, Sunmi was quite popular when she opened up about BPD. And as she was saying, while we don't diagnose personality disorders in teenagedom, they do often come about due to trauma in youth or in adolescence. And so it's something that she has been, would have been dealing with either the development, the things that created it, or the symptoms of it for many years before she opened up about it. Most idols who are neurodivergent and choose to open up about it don't do so until their career is quite stable and their popularity can pull them through any potential issues. Or until they, leave their agency, join a totally different agency that's more open to quote unquote controversial topics. Not that I think it actually is, but regardless. There does seem to be some consistent leeway for temporary anxiety issues. Many idols take hiatuses for their mental health that is usually attributed to some type of temporary anxiety concern. You can ask me how much I believe that excuse, and that would certainly depend on the situation, but yeah. Which of course brings us to Han Ji-sung. Officially, per JYPE in 2019, when Han took some time off of his schedule, he was, quote unquote, showing symptoms of intermittent psychological anxiety, though it does not impede on the majority of his regular broadcast schedules and stages. He feels extreme tension when he is close to groups of people. Yeah, okay, sure. Okay, listen, if that's a fully accurate depiction, and they did claim when he came back from hiatus that it was treated and cured. I don't know if they said cured, but they did say treated. And I'm sure there was treatment. I'm sure that's accurate. If it's a fully accurate depiction, this would probably fall under, in ICD terms, per the ICD. So if you're in a country that uses the DSM, you probably know the term DSM. Internationally, there's something called the ICD. It's an international diagnostic code. Would qualify probably either as social or situational phobia. If it was fully and completely treated, which is to say that his brief time off of activities when he was formally, officially in treatment, got him to walk out without major life-impacting symptoms of this anxiety from there on out, then that would have been what we call an adjustment disorder, and thus a very temporary neurodivergence. Usually adjustment disorders, it's like something happens, there is difficulty adjusting, and that's like 3 to 6 months. That being said, Han has been pretty open in interviews and definitely his music about his difficulties not being quite so temporally isolated. It doesn't take much reading between the lines. It's not even reading between the lines. It's like having basic deductive skills to understand that Han has experienced mental health concerns for quite a long time. I actually have like a little bit of personal discomfort with some of the pre-debut Han jokes, because Han has said a few times, like, he doesn't know why he was so angry back then. And he was so angry. I do not blame anyone who couldn't listen to Stray Kids again after hearing or learning about Han's rap from when he was 13 that was recorded. But I've also worked with enough teens to know that if a 13-year-old is rapping with slurs and just visceral hatred in their words, they are learning that from somewhere. Not just the language, not just the white supremacy, but the rage itself. I'm not going to get deep into the situation here. It's just not something that I think is worth re-digging up to the surface at this point. But it's important for reference to say that a young teenager known for getting into fights, for throwing around hate-filled music, for being unable to regulate themselves, there is something we don't, and personally, ourselves won't, because this is not a person we know. But there's something we don't understand that was happening there. And any teenager in that situation, there is something happening there. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, suddenly concerned, and then knowing that I'm not going to dig much into it, I will say he did apologize in a way that I personally believe. It's hard to unlearn such deep-rooted hatred and white supremacy, but I think he's done at least some of that work, and his apology did take personal responsibility for his behavior. That's really neither here nor there. I'm just saying from my perspective, from my belief, from my standpoint, which is not really relevant. But I've worked with a number of very angry teenagers. I've worked with a number of very angry teenagers. A lot of teenagers with quote-unquote conduct disorders. Fuck conduct disorder diagnosis, by the way. Teenagers who have been told that they're dangerous. Teenagers whose parents would call the police on them for their own self-harm, or for screaming too loud, or for becoming physical when their parents would grab them or push them around. I've worked with sweet teenagers who were told that they were manipulative, selfish, self-serving, guilt trippers, rude, and liars, who had been told that since they were 6 or 7 or 8. Teenagers convinced by adults to admit to doing things that they don't believe that they did. Teenagers told that they're not holding up their end, they're not contributing, they're not giving back, they're not being respectful, but who were never told what any of that actually means, or what it would look like, or what their exact failure was. None of those teenagers have been neurotypical. And many of them, due to the contexts I've personally worked in, but many of them have been autistic. And while it is true that many of those teenagers and some of the preteens as well, the 11, 12-year-olds, did do some things that made some people mad at them, not a single one has ever been violent, dangerous, manipulative, cruel, really even lying much, or enraged at me. Not a single one. I had one who lied a little bit at the beginning of our relationship, but in like such an obvious way that I could like literally roll my eyes at them. But for the most part, never at me. In fact, a snarky, angry teenager is one of my favorite people, and not in like a condescending, like weird way, but just like truly, I love snarky, sarcastic, pissed off teenagers with just a little love, a little trust, just a little bit of talking to them like they're a full human instead of a lesser. They tend to be suddenly just sweet and open and trusting. And it has truly meant so much to me to be able to be a trusted and safe adult to a number of teens, because they're so fucking funny and generous of spirit in a way that so often adults become jaded out of. But yeah, some of those teens, a lot of those teens, were considered very difficult by others, at least. Here's the thing about autistic meltdowns. Many people think that some autistic folks, their meltdowns are inherently violent. We don't really have reason to believe this. Violence is what they learn from somewhere. Maybe because they were forcibly restrained too many times during a meltdown, instead of given appropriate somatic outlets, like ripping up cardboard. Maybe because when they were verbally lashed out at as a very young person before they developed empathy or a sense of the issue when hurting others, the adults around them took it personally and they responded in kind. Or they screamed back, or they tried to punish their child in the midst of extreme emotional and somatic dysregulation. They were never given real tools, never given real methods of coping with the physical reality that happens to someone during a meltdown or a shutdown. And that just stuck with them. And sometimes those kids become angry. So angry, so overwhelmed. They spend every day on edge, and any one thing can push them over. Whether they're screaming or sobbing or throwing their head against a wall, they don't know what to do, and they simply collapse. And then with every collapse, they struggle to stand up, but another kick happens before they can even remember where their feet are. It's similar often with children and teens who have panic attacks. Panic attacks and meltdowns are different, but that result of cyclical dysregulation that feels impossible to escape is very similar and incredibly traumatic. And if a young person goes through that, again, whether it's panic attacks or meltdowns or shutdowns or anything similar, you don't have to go through that cycle very long before it really burns you out, before it really tears through your soul. I have never met a teenager that angry who was okay, who was fine. I am someone who hesitates to use nevers and no ones and assurances that things just don't happen, but I truly struggle to conceptualize a teenager as angry as Han was, who isn't experiencing a disabling, likely neuro-related condition, or experiencing certain types of abuse or other traumas that would lead to a disabling, likely neuro-related condition. The reason why abuse is traumatic is because it traumatizes you and changes the way your brain functions. I have a lot more to say about Han, but we'll talk about it in the Alien storyline episodes. So with that mini tangent, that mini pre-debut Han tangent, we can move back onto evidence of neurodivergence in Stray Kids as a whole. No, we can drink some tea first. That's what we can do. Yeah, that's a good idea. Such a good idea. Thank you for suggesting it. Oh God, how far? I think I'm over halfway through the. Oh God, I've been recording for an hour. Cool. Cool. Rad. Awesome. Dope. Fantastic. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Listen. Whenever you're sitting around and you're going, do I yap too much? Just think of me. And you'll know the answer. All right. It doesn't take a lot of mind reading to acknowledge that most, if not all, of SKZ has experienced some kind of neurodivergence. One of the really interesting things about Stray Kids writing most of their own music is how much of their own experiences they put into it. I don't think that songs like Voices, Side Effects, Insomnia, Rock, etc. are just devoid of personal experience. Especially considering how young Thracha were when they were writing these songs. In this way, we are given a lens into their experiences that we don't see from many idol groups. And idol groups that have been self-produced are, for the most part, of earlier generations that really didn't tend to sing about mental health issues so much. And I think this is a huge reason why SKZ is particularly neurodivergent coded, is because they have more leeway to express those divergences. The arts are filled with neurodivergent folks, just littered with us bitches. So while SKZ may have a higher ratio than most groups, a ratio that may very well approach 8 of 8, that doesn't mean there's not plenty of it elsewhere. The other contributing factor is selection bias. Bangchan chose Stray Kids for a variety of reasons, but I'm sure that some of those reasons included personality fit, people he vibed with who vibed with everyone else, mostly, considering they were all teenage boys trapped in a horror show of reality madness. Whatever. Now, when we acknowledge that there's a huge spectrum of ND folks, we can't just claim that ND folks flock to other ND folks. However, it will be more common that people of similar neurodivergences are going to find more in common and have more ability to communicate with and understand those of similar neurodivergences. That's why, systems will often befriend other systems, or autistic folks will commonly befriend other autistic folks, etc. And people who have neurodivergences that are similar will be more likely to find common ground too. So for instance, there's a lot in bipolar that looks very similar to ADHD. And I, at least anecdotally, have known a number of folks who build really close relationships between those two neurodivergences. There's a lot of talk about autistic folks and ADHD folks befriending each other. I think that's a bit more complicated than we make it out to be. The co-occurrence rate of autism and ADHD. is, I don't remember the exact stat, and I think it's not fully explored yet, but I think that, so people who have autism, about like between 40 and 60% of them also have ADHD. But people mistake that stat as being the same as people who are ADHD and the co-occurrence rate of autism. So those who are ADHD only have co-current autism, I want to say like 23, I know it's on the CDC website. I think it's like 23% of the time or 21% of the time, something like that. Somewhere between 20 and 25% of the time. So are non-ADHD autistics befriending allistic ADHD folks at higher rates than other allistics? Which is to say, are autists who do not have ADHD actually finding more common ground with ADHD folks who are not autistic at higher rates than they're making friends with other people who are not autistic? I don't know that we know that, and I think that sounds like social media mythology to me. That was a massive tangent. Was irrelevant. But point is, selection bias, right? You're gonna, because this group was picked by the leader of the group instead of just like thrown together from a survival show, the selection bias means that they are more likely to be more similar to each other. So what are some of the things I see that probably many people have seen, that are some of the things that people probably relate a lot to, that seem to be indications of neurodivergence? And I know that I have not fully defined my definition of neurodivergence yet. This is true sort of regardless of, the specific definition. And I will explain how some of these things might be true relating to my specific definition next episode. I'm not diagnosing anyone with anything. I am not diagnosing anyone with anything. I do not diagnose strangers with things. That is a horribly unethical thing to do. But I will give some of the overview of what people are probably relating to from a neurodivergence perspective. And then like some neurodivergences or, some experience that those things might be related to. So a big one is their relationship with objects. Physical environment has a huge impact on anyone's brain, but Stray Kids certainly has an atypical, based on the expected, relationship with material objects in their physical world. They lose shit all the fucking time. I mean, shout out Yeonjin in particular, but like, it ain't just him. And they become so attached to like specific items. I think about there's that interview, I think it was like a post-it or drop it, I don't know, interview, but Hani went on this whole thing about how like I wore this one plaid shirt for a week straight. They have, and I don't mean this in a kink way. It does not have to be a kink thing. If you think it's always a kink thing, you are wildly disconnected from a large chunk of the kink community. But like, they literally have personas. They have personas. Again, not in a kink way, but like that's literally what they are. And then they anthropomorphize. That is to say that they like put human-esque qualities and personalities they anthropomorphize the shit out of the stuffed animals of those personas. Like, and also every stuffed animal they have? God, what's an autistic person without way too many stuffed animals? No, I'm sorry, I'm not diagnosing anyone with anything. This is where embraceautism.com flashes on the screen. Bangshan in particular is known for like being very, very particular about his physical environment and how objects are placed and used, right? So there's a lot of different ways that their relationship with physical objects as a group is not within the standard deviation. Then there's the somatic expression. They maybe have never stood nor sat still in their entire lives for more than about 3.2 seconds. Have any of them experienced stillness? They vacillate wildly between incredibly loud and very quiet, at least according to both themselves and some reports of behind-the-scenes behavior. And yet several of them have these incredibly intense reactions to sudden or particular noises or other stimulation. Several of them seem to engage in echolalia, the repetition of sounds or vocalizations by another person, echopraxia, the repetition of others' movements, and other echo phenomena, that is, other repetition of somebody else. Many of them engage in a lot of repetitive self-soothing movements and gestures as well. Now, all of these things could be representative of a number of neurodivergences, and certainly neurotypical people can and do engage in most, if not all, of these things to a certain degree as well. But we're really talking about like the combination of things, right? It's a lot. It's a lot of those things done a lot of the time. And like I said, it could be representative of a number of neurodivergences, right? Obviously, yes, some of them are quite autistic coded. Some of them are very ADHD coded. But we could also be looking at things like dyspraxia. We could be looking at things like some of the dissociative disorders, be it like full dissociative identity disorder or a, something like other specified dissociative disorder or whatever diagnostic labels we want to put on it, something like structured dissociation. We could be looking at OCD. We could be looking at bipolar. So there's a lot of neurodivergences that these things could be symptoms of. But I think one thing that is definitely true is that like this is not a collective of typically expected behavior. But that does lead us to a really important question, which is, what is a neurotypical person? What actually is a neurotypical person? Because haven't most people had periods of time of really intense depression or anxiety, or one of the many, 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 many things under the list of neurodivergences? And how do we define experiences that exist on a spectrum? How do we determine when they're neurodivergent or not? Is it when you meet the diagnostic criteria? Can we say that meeting the diagnostic criteria is evidence of a neurodivergence? If someone scores a 35 on the PTSD assessment and somebody scores a 40, do we claim that only one of those two is neurodivergent? Dr. Devon Price, who is a doctor of sociology, but well respected as a theorist in the autism community, has argued that there's no such thing as neurotypical. That neurotypical is simply a mental construct that is more based in our expectations of behavior culturally than it is a factual concept. We don't, after all, have a complete scan of the prime neurotypical brain. I find this to be an interesting theory, but one with only certain applicability. And so this concept is essentially what I'm referring to when I talk about the NeuroPlatonic ideal. Plato's theory of forms is one of his metaphysical theories that claims that, essentially, like quickly boiled down, don't come at me, all things have an inherent essence of like what they are that is absolute and unchangeable. So when we talk about a Platonic ideal, we're talking about what is considered the absolute true form of the object or concept. So our NeuroPlatonic ideal is the cultural expectation within whatever our cultural confine is of what the natural and uncontrived thoughts and behavior of a person look like. So, that's just sort of saying that within the culture that you are looking at, there are expectations of how you act just because you act that way, right? The natural behavior, the unforced behavior. And that expectation is going to be different for different cultures. And it's not necessarily based on a literal like brain scan or something like that. It is just the expectation. And that's because, there is inherent neurodiversity. Like probably no two brains are exactly the same. So we can't have a singular neurotypical brain. So instead we have this NeuroPlatonic ideal. But there's a reason that I changed the words, right? That I gave it a new term. And that's because I think that there is really important application to the idea of neurotypical. And I like to use a different definition of neurotypical, which is someone who does not experience disabling effects from how their brain works. So that sort of helps answer our questions of like, is it a diagnostic label? Is it a diagnostic criteria? No, neurodivergence has nothing to do with diagnostics. It's completely irrelevant. Okay, well then is it like, what does it mean? How do we distinguish? How do we distinguish neurodivergent from neurotypical? It's about if you're disabled. If the effects that are experienced from the neurotype have a disabling impact. Oh, which means it's time to talk about disability. And I have been recording for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Time for a tea break. Oh, God. This is a nightmare. Do I just start editing out my script? Maybe I say too many things. Maybe I yap too much. We're going to find out. I mean, you're all capable of reading a Wikipedia page, right? Yeah, okay, so the Chan cult. I'm not going to tell you the story of how it started because I think it's funny that people don't know. Because it's a really silly story. It's absolutely asinine the way it happened. And that does make it funnier. However, then there started being fake bangchans. And that was really funny for a day. And then people took it way too seriously. And then they got really mad when one of the fake bangchans was like, yes, I am in fact not actually bangchan. And people were like so upset. And then, but then one of them is really good. And by really good, I mean like knows like a little too much. Like they've got to be staff or something. I don't know. But it stresses me out because I did call them Jackson Wang's second burner account. And that's a long story as to how that happened, but it did. Drink some tea. Stray Kids. Disability. No, we're not at Stray Kids yet. It's time to talk about disability. Cool. Okay. I am going to need y'all to really sit with any discomfort that comes up here. Ableism is one of the most accepted forms of marginalization on the left, if not the most accepted. From leftist events refusing to provide masked event options, to unwillingness to move language away from stigmatizing language like crazy or insane, to refusal to utilize identity first language rather than person first language, even to using neurodivergent as a euphemism for autistic, which we shouldn't do, or avoiding saying autistic by saying neurodivergent instead. All of those things. Ableism on the left, all the time. Much of the ADHD disinformation on social media, and there is a lot of it. One study, and this was like a couple years ago too, identified that at least 50% of the ADHD information on TikTok is outright false. Not even just like, oh, that's like missing some info. False, wrong, incorrect. Much of the ADHD disinformation is based on autism stigma and unwillingness to identify clearly autistic traits as autism. Villainization of personality disorders like NPD or ASPD, that is narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Conflation of abusers with certain diagnoses. For instance, the conflation that all abusers have NPD. Internalized ableism is also just so prevalent in disabled folks, even those exceptionally aware of what internalized ableism is. So this conversation may very well trigger a lot of defense mechanisms in you, especially if you are disabled, but either have been unwilling to identify that way or are still working through the early stages of unlearning your own internalized ableism. But it also might trigger those defense mechanisms if you're not disabled. It might be rough. You might have to sit with some things. But that's okay. All right, so if you've spent any time at all in disability spaces, you'll have heard of models of disability. The most common spoken about are the medical and the social models of disability, but there's actually quite a large number of models. We're going to break those down a little bit more in a moment. I'm not going to break them down as much as I thought I was going to because this is way too long and that's just too much information. But this is our way of identifying, like, okay, what does it mean to say that neurotypicality is to not be disabled by the way your brain works? What does it mean to say that neurodivergence is that your brain veers from the expected in such a way that it is disabling? At the highest level, we have like two conceptions of disability. We have deficits concepts and kind of deficit oppositional concepts. The models that view disability as a deficit view it first as a problem, ideally one to be resolved. The models that try to work in opposition to the deficit models prioritize the experience and identity of the disabled person or society's relationship to disability in general. Now, there's a lot of different disability model taxonomies out there. That is just the way that like models break down. It just sort of depends on where you look. Full transparency, I like Wikipedia's. And I like Wikipedia's because it has some of the most, like, it has some of the most thoroughly broken down models. Like, of all of the models out there, it has sort of a collation of the models. So, like, fully, if you just go to Models of Disability Wikipedia page, you can learn a lot about this. But, you know, just to break it down like a little bit for the sake of it here. So within deficit focus models, we have sort of the personal problem model. So that's kind of a tragedy or charity model. Those are like the most common is tragedy and charity that we see, which is where we see disability as like a tragic thing where people are like victims of disability. We have sort of the expert or professional models. So that's where the medical model comes in. And that's, you know, is the viewing of disability as a medical problem that needs to be treated and cured. There's also underneath that the biopsychosocial model, which is, you know, sort of as a professional myself, obviously one that I use extensively because that is my job. The biopsychosocial model sort of is made to build bridges between how like biological, psychological, and social factors influence the outcomes of medical issues, health issues, we'll say. This can really help with how we can understand multiple factors in your life being at play, like environmental and social and biological, and how they can all sort of aggravate each other and create increased disability. There are issues with it, depending on how people use it. There's then models that look at disability as sort of a collective problem, which still is sort of a deficits-based model, right? It's still looking at disability as a through the lens of how to fix it. So an economic model understands it as a deficit to the economy. There's obviously the eugenics model. That's common. And we're not going to talk about that because I don't want to be depressed right now. Then we have models that work in opposition to the deficit model. So there's the social model. That's kind of the most well-known one there, which essentially views that disability is caused by ableism, that disability is primarily disabling due to social conditions. So somebody who uses a wheelchair, a lot of their disability is because of a world that is not accessible. And it is the world's fault that it is not accessible, right? Like, you could build ramps. And of course, you know, different wheelchair users have different opinions on that, but that's like a common example. There's the identity model and the affirmation model. So a lot of times, you know, people might look at autism underneath the affirmation model and the identity model. So looking at disability as part of a personal identity, it's a rejection of the tragedy model.
There might also be some parts of that look at like strengths as well. There's a rights-based model that looks a lot at what are the rights that we need to fulfill for people, or rather, what does it take to ensure that disabled people have access to the same human rights that everybody else does? And that also like helps pull together the idea that, yeah, some disabled people do want a treatment, they do want a cure, they do want to function under the medical model, and that is like super fair and valid, because why would you look at, you know, I have fibromyalgia, for instance. I have no desire to look at my fibromyalgia sort of through like the identity model per se. I'm not going to be able to have it cured, so there are ways in which it is disabling from a social model perspective. But like mostly, I would love if somebody said, here, take a pill and you'll never have fibromyalgia again. I'd be like, fuck yeah. If somebody said, here, take a pill and you'll never have autism again, which like, first of all, eugenics. Second of all, no. Third of all, I don't want that, right? That would suck. I don't know who I am without the autism. That's just, you're just killing me, right? And then there's post-structural models, which are like more complicated. And then there are other models as well that are also more complicated. We don't have to get into it too much. So those are our models of disability, which will help inform the answer to the question of what is disability? What is it to be disabled, right? Within post-structuralist models, it's an always changing question and answer, because disability is essentially about impairment, but impairment against what? Right? So our concept of what it means to be disabled is sort of ever changing based on cultural context. That's the post-structural model. Within an economic model, the impairment is not being able to hold a job, right? It's pretty reductive, not very helpful, but it is a measure of disability. Within a rights-based model, disability may be primarily defined by not having equitable access to certain rights due to physical, mental, cognitive, developmental, etc. differences. However, even in a universe where people have full equitable access to rights and services, there would still be people who are disabled. In fact, disability is considered pretty much the only form of marginalization that every human will experience. Every single human will become disabled. I tend to view disability as an impairment to engage with life and activities to the extent that an expected, fully healthy human body could engage with. So what is our like standard deviation of a fully healthy human body? What can they do? And if you are unable to engage with life and activities to that extent, there is some level of disability. So in that way, yes, aging is in and of itself a disabling event, eventually. Many people are disabled and do not realize it. A lot of times this is because over the course of their disability, they found coping mechanisms, whether healthy or unhealthy, that offset that disability in some way. This usually catches up to folks eventually, but it's quite common. For instance, a lot of folks with chronic pain disabilities from when they were young don't recognize themselves as disabled. This is partially due to not realizing that others are not in chronic pain. I remember the first time I found out that some people never experience migraines. And that is a moment I remember. I was in math class when I found that out. It's a rude place to find that out, by the way. And partially they don't realize they're disabled because they're just like, get used to it. You find ways around it. Without proper treatment, though, a lot of chronic pain conditions can become worse and can really diminish quality of life without the person even realizing that their quality of life is diminished. So before I was a clinician, I worked in tech and in games. And when I was working in tech, I was the founder of our disability employee resource groups. And I remember talking to somebody who met the definition of disabled in at least 2 different ways, but really just didn't believe they were disabled enough to, like, for it to count. This is super common. Due to many of the deficit's models of disability around pity and charity and viability to participate in capitalism, many people will think that if they are capable of living a fulfilling life, then they must not really be disabled. But this person's experiences, I mean, they required them to work from home multiple times a week. They needed to take days off at a time. They would spend a lot of time trying to manage their emotions around it. But they lived a fulfilling life. And that's not necessarily in line with how we view being disabled. There are K-pop idols who are physically disabled. You will know I don't use person-first language, which is to say a person with a disability. I use identity-first language. If an individual uses person-first language instead of identity-first language, I'd, of course, use the way they prefer to be referred to. But within the sort of disabled activist and academic communities, at least within the ones that I'm in, and I recognize that the ones I'm in are English speaking. But within those communities, we have moved largely to prioritizing identity-first language. Person-first language, I actually had a supervisor who worked really hard to push person-first language like early on when it first started coming up. And that was because the way that the way that the stigma worked meant that providers were talking about people real poorly, right? So, you know, something that she told me when I told her about identity first language, and she had to go like research it to be convinced. But that's fine. She researched it. She was convinced. But she told me that she remembered people saying like, hey, have you talked to that schizophrenic in room 206? Which is like obviously a terrible way to talk about people. So they pivoted to person first language in order basically to get caretakers and providers and non-disabled people to like not treat other people badly and see them as people. Because it's a lot meaner to be like, or at least I guess it seems meaner to people to be like, have you talked to that person with schizophrenia in room 206? I relate it very similar to any other type of identity-like thing, right? Like, I'm a queer bitch. I'm not a bitch with queerness. That'd be weird. That being said, if someone said about me, like, have you talked to that queer over there? Like, yeah, now I'm offended. Right? The dehumanization was not in the identity. It wasn't in utilizing like the adjective. It wasn't calling a person that. So we primarily use identity first language now. Because for a lot of us, yeah, we're disabled like indefinitely. And it is part of our identity. And it's an important part of our identity. And when people remove the identity from us, it implies that they can remove the disability sometimes too. So within disabilities that are in the medical model, we might be more inclined to use person-first language. Somebody who has cancer, we're probably not going to call them cancerous. I mean, I don't know, but they might refer to themselves as chronically ill, and maybe if there were an appropriate, just depending on the person, and depending on what their treatment looked like and things like that, you know, they might choose, depending on how they felt about it, to refer to themselves with some type of identity first language. Some people who have chronic migraines use the term migraineur. I never have because I don't like it, though it is true. With autism, this is particularly important, though, because there keep trying to be pushes to cure autism, which, again, eugenics, but saying person with autism implies that there is still a person without the autism, and there is not. So anyway, that's why I use identity first language. There are K-pop idols who are disabled or people with disabilities, depending on how they prefer to be referred to. EXO's Lay is a hemophiliac. FX's Crystal is anemic. Choi Yoo-jung has had a chronic pain condition that has resulted in a number of hiatuses. Obviously, Big Ocean is a fully deaf and or hard of hearing group. I believe that they're usually referred to as a group with hearing impairments, but my understanding, at least from the English-speaking deaf community, is that hearing impaired is considered problematic at best as a phrase, much like, special needs is considered problematic at best as a phrase. I don't know how Big Ocean themselves identify, though. And there are so many K-pop idols who are now disabled due to injuries or late onset disabilities. There's a lot of herniated discs in K-pop, which can permanently disrupt an artist's ability to dance and perform. Obviously, Felix has had his spinal injuries, and Felix is disabled. Possibly permanently. Herniated discs don't usually go from being disabling to being non-disabling. There can be dramatic improvements made, but there's usually a lifelong impact. And I would guess that a lot of idols have a history of disability regardless of their current status. So, for instance, I'm going to go back to it because I used to specialize in it. Eating disorders are usually disabling events. And having severe nutritional deficiencies, especially in teenagers, can have really huge long-term impact. Low-key, I would not be surprised if certainly not all, it's a very high-impact job and can be dangerous, but if part of the prevalence of spinal and bone injuries in idols has to do with nutritional deficiencies in youth, as eating disorders can put people at higher risk of developing osteoarthritis, bone fragility, and a ton of other things. And that is a tangent we don't need to get into. Some disabled people will find that their disabilities are not as disabling to them as they would be to someone else. Someone with a hypermobility disorder who lives a life that allows for an appropriate amount of movement, but is not particularly invested in, doing a lot of intense vinyasa yoga or competitive bouldering, is going to have a much easier time managing their disability than someone with the same disorder who works a very physically demanding job with minimal rest or recovery options, who also has, say, a co-occurrent anxiety disorder. That assessment is more within our biopsychosocial model of disability, wherein we assess how someone's environment and situation and mental state change the way they're impacted by their disability. Autism and ADHD are disabilities, just like period. For autistic folks, yes, this is overt and obvious for high support needs individuals. When we talk about autism, we talk about high, medium, and low support needs. There is a wonderful person who runs an Instagram account by the handle Black Spectrum Scholar. And they wrote on Threads recently that if you're not disabled, you're not autistic. And that's accurate. However, many people don't realize the ways that they are disabled by their autism, especially if they're self-diagnosed, even when that self-diagnosis is well researched. So people might hear that and go like, well, I'm not disabled, so are you saying I'm not autistic? And it's like, well, if you're autistic, you are disabled. But maybe you don't exactly know how. Many of my autistic clients were self-diagnosed before they came to see me. And for a lot of them, they learned the ways that they were disabled as we were working together. There are ways that things like autism and ADHD and other innate neurodivergences are defined largely by social societal expectations, in which it is a disability by that social model. There are also ways that it would be disabling regardless. For autism, meltdowns and shutdowns are incredibly disabling. Like I said earlier, they're conceptually similar to panic attacks. And a lot of autistic people think that their meltdowns and shutdowns are panic attacks. Or they're also similar to like pain flares. They actively disrupt our ability to live our lives. There are non-speaking and non-verbal autistics as well who can have similar struggles as deaf folks, especially non-verbal autistics. For those who don't know, non-verbal is somebody who communicates but doesn't use language at all, whereas non-speaking doesn't use spoken language. That being said, sometimes autistics are non-verbal because they weren't given appropriate accessibility devices as children or weren't taught to type or write or read, usually due to the belief that they couldn't. And so while they may have been non-speaking, if provided appropriate tools and care, they end up being nonverbal until they are given or find for themselves those tools. Even low support needs autistics experience disability. For me, I have selective mutism. And if you don't know, selective mutism refers to mutism that happens in certain situations, not like chosen mutism. Some people hear selective mutism and they're like, oh, so you're just choosing not to speak? And it's like, no, in selective situations, I become mute. For me, when I melt down and shut down. Some people refer to this as going nonverbal or going non-speaking. My understanding is that referring to it as such is detrimental to non-speaking and nonverbal autistics who hold those as identities. Selective mutism is more accurate anyway, honestly. Due to my dynamic disabilities and comorbidities, I would have been somewhere between a low and medium needs autistic. I have lived alone and managed to go to school and work a job, but it was a truly miserable experience. And I think if I had had to do it for much longer than the few years I did, I don't know that I would have been able to keep functioning. I have a lot of support needs met by my nesting partner, whom I've lived with since I was 21. I also have a lot of support needs met by having access to my therapist, who I've been seeing for like 8 years. Shout out to Heather. And sometimes by friends as well, and by living in an excellent medical hub where I can shop for doctors as I need. This doesn't necessarily mean that my level of support needs really changes, though arguably it has for me because some of my comorbidities have been treated and dramatically reduced, such as my OCD, which reduces the intensity of the disabling impacts of my autism. It mostly means that I'm getting those support needs met, though. So it can be perceived as having dynamic support needs, but level of support needs is an average, though. It's not like a day-by-day thing. It's just that my average has kind of gone down due both to my co-occurring and comorbid disabilities and because I get those support needs met. So I don't really remember at this point. I don't necessarily know what it would be like for me to not get those support needs met at this point. With ADHD, there's difficulty with memory. That can be a big, big impairment for people. Obviously, yes, there's issues with managing work and labor. There can be very significant social disruption for both of these disabilities for different reasons. With ADHD, like with the dopamine seeking in relationships, it can happen that ADHD folks become very, very invested in another person and then suddenly lose interest. And that can cause significant pain and rupture to the relationship. ADHD has the infamous ADHD tax, the price of forgetting to pay bills, losing items, missing appointments, etc. Considering that ADHD folks can already struggle with money management, maintaining jobs, things like that, the extra cost of the impact of the disability can become more disabling. And that's like only a small number of ways that these two neurodivergences can be disabling. So I reiterate then, to be neurotypical, differentiated from the NeuroPlatonic ideal, is to not have disabling impact from one's neurology. To be neurodivergent is to have a brain that differentiates such that there is a disabling impact. If this were a neurodivergence-focused podcast, and I was working primarily within certain academic spaces, this would probably be a controversial opinion. I just have to say that because it probably would be. Probably be getting yelled at by at least 4 other clinicians. 3 of them wouldn't even be... I've spent a lot of time in quote-unquote neuro-affirming clinician spaces, and let me tell you. There are some folks who believe that certain neurodivergences are only disabilities due to the social model or aren't disabilities at all. I disagree. I just disagree. I think the term loses any form of usefulness or precision if non-disabled people are pulled into it. I think disability is the only solid ground we can really use to define it. And I will argue with whomever I need to argue with. But for the sake of this K-pop podcast, that's the terminology we're using and how we're defining it. So we've constructed an understanding of a neuroplatonic ideal, of neurodivergence, of neurotypicality, and of disability. Which leads us to the question of, essentially, what is the constructed neuroplatonic ideal of an idol? How does or doesn't Stray Kids fit into it? And is there a common neuroplatonic ideal that Stay has thus created for Stray Kids themselves, right? Like if you go really into the meta, right, there's the neuroplatonic ideal for idols, but then like Stray Kids are a bunch of fucking weirdo losers who we love. Have we as Stay created a new neuroplatonic ideal for them? And then what are the consequences when they don't match that neuroplatonic ideal? Because there are consequences when they don't match it. And I have a lot of opinions about those. And I will spend a lot of time bitching about airport photos. But that's going to be the next part because I've been recording for an hour and 52 goddamn minutes. Fuck me. Oh. Yeah, no, I just have an all caps at the end of this script. I think that's another part, ? Yeah, it's another fucking part. I'm done talking. I'm so done yapping. Stay. I love you. Fuck, I'm supposed to have a close off. Oh, fuck. I forgot that I'm supposed to make a pun. Okay, wait, I'll say the rest of it before I make a pun. I have an almost 3-hour breakdown of Railway from a clinician perspective where I talk a lot about dissociation on YouTube. If for some reason you want to do that. Same handle. No, not same handle. It's Metaskizverse. Same handle on Threads. The description will have a link to my card. If you want to give me money for this, you can also do so on my Ko-Fi. And I didn't think of a pun while I was, what songs did I choose? S-Class Cheese and Voices. Stay. Oh no, this is gonna be bad. Can I say this out loud? Oh no. I wonder if I can get all of these No, I can't figure out how to get S class in, and it would take too long. No, I can't say something that that cheesy, but I'm chink out loud. So instead we'll just say stay. I hope you enjoyed listening to my voice for the last almost 2 hours. And I love all of yours that I've never heard, but I would love them as well. So now go listen to some Stray Kids voices. I love you. Good night.